All right, I'm gonna keep myself honest. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Pleasure to see you all. My name is Pascal Leone. I'm the Executive Director of the Supportive Housing Network of New York, and welcome to Race Equity in Practice. We're going to hear from some equity practitioners on how a transformative justice framework can be applied to dismantle structural racism, strengthen accountability practices, and address the way that public infrastructure investment has historically been used to harm communities of color and low-wealth communities. And so our panelists, who will introduce themselves in a moment, will highlight some of the emerging practices, programs, and initiatives that support community-driven solutions, foster institutional change, and support a more equitable outcomes in public investments. As I mentioned, I'm with the Supportive Housing Network of New York. 6 months into being the executive director, but previously worked at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. See one of my former colleagues here, Sherry, who could keep me honest on some of this work. But the last 3 years there, I served as the VP of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and really leading the organization on their transformational change to really center equity and justice through policy, through program, and the deployment of capital. And so I'm really excited for today's conversation. And with that, I will turn it, oh wait, let me just moment. We are remixed to the agenda and the panel, so you can see it's 3 of us here. Unfortunately, I am going to be the moderator, and unfortunately, Kathy will not be, from Race Forward will not be with us today. She had an accident this morning, but she is well. Everyone is okay. That is most important. So we have a slight remix, and I want to thank Jay for stepping in so quickly this morning. So with that, I'll now turn it over to Ramona and Jay to introduce themselves.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Guatuque Ini Inaru, and my colonial name is Ramona Ferreira. I am a public housing tenant from the South Bronx, and I founded Save Section 9. It's a national coalition of public housing tenants fighting to stop the privatization of our housing stock. While doing so, we focus on educating and then empowering tenants. And previously, I was with the Department of Defense and the FBI conducting community outreach focused on disaster response, which makes me perfect for public housing. And I am currently identifying as disabled, Indigenous, and Latina.
Good morning, everyone. Peace and blessings to you all. My name is Jay Williams, and I am a program associate with Collaborative Solutions. We're a housing technical assistance provider and capacity building nonprofit. In my day-to-day, I work as the Low Income Housing Coalition of Alabama's program and policy coordinator. In my past, I have been privileged to work across several different areas of practice, whether it be working as a administrator for the Chapin Hall Institute for Children, or working as a census state coordinator for a hard to count collaborative in Alabama that focused on improving the undercount of historically undercounted communities in the state of Alabama. And I'm happy to be here with you all this morning.
Wonderful. And so before I turn it back to our esteemed panelists, I just want to share a little bit of some of the work that I've done in my journey. As I mentioned, I'm a recovering equity officer from a national organization, and I kind of say that in jest, but just being really clear that we know that the arc of justice doesn't bend on its own, right? It requires commitment, it requires resources, it requires effort, and it requires action that is consistent, action that is accountable to communities, accountable to the people we impact and that we serve. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. I'm just curious, I know we have about maybe 40, 50 people in the room. Just by a show of hands, how many folks here are currently, their organizations undergoing some type of equity transformation journey or process? Okay, great. Wonderful. And so, this type of transformation and this journey we call this our forever work, right? There's no end to it. But we have to be clear about our direction. But it really requires us to have just this ongoing assessment and a deep audit of the practices, the policies, and the structures that all of our institutions uphold that further racist and inequitable outcomes, right? Because that's really the default settings of our organizations and our institutions when you think about it, right? And so it just really requires us to have a framework for how we're going to operationalize our strategies, both internally, because I believe, again, culture. Culture eats strategy every day of the week. And so how our internal culture operates, our behavior, really affects the strategies and how we get right with community, right? And so it really requires us to really be clear and have a framework and clear about our destination, our intended impact, and what success looks like, right? Because a lot of times when we have no theory of change, when we have no clear direction, any progress, any movement might look like progress, and we don't want to mistake the two. And I think that's really important. And so last night I was just thinking, like, what do I want to share with folks? While I've done this DIB work, I've always done this, whether working in reproductive justice, working in environmental justice, working in housing justice. The personal has always been political for me, right? And race and how we come to this space has always centered my work. And so I was just thinking about what are the lessons or the I don't want to say lessons because I don't think we all learned them yet, but just the ways of understanding that I've recognized over the years. And the first one is that this work is evolution and it's not revolution. And I know that is hard to hear, even for myself, who wants revolution in my heart. But we know that change does not happen overnight. And that we have to play the long game. We have to play the long game in the pursuit of justice, because we don't want to, in the pursuit of justice, do the injustice of really burning out, particularly Black and Brown and Indigenous folks in this work, because the burnout is absolutely real. And it's a recognition that not everything is going to be transformational. There's a lot about this work that is transactional, whether it's doing organizational assessments, how we collect data, how we disaggregate data, right? And how we use that data can feel transactional at times, but how we use it and how we hold ourselves accountable to community can have transformative impact. So I think it's having that balance and knowing the difference between the two. I want to be clear that we will make mistakes in this work. Mistakes will happen, harm will happen, right? We can't guarantee safety in this work, but we have to commit to repairing, to healing, and to restoring when mistakes happen. While we're actively trying to unlearn centuries of oppressive behaviors, again, which are the default settings of our organizations and our institutions, we're also trying to simultaneously commit to new ways of doing and being. And so in that process, mistakes will happen, but it's about how we repair. We may misgender people, right? It's about, again, how do we quickly repair, how do we heal, and how do we restore? I love Adrienne Maree Brown. I don't know if any folks are a fan of hers, but when she talks about moving at the speed of trust and understanding, it's important to meet people where they're at their journey. We can't leave them there. That's what holds us honest to this work. I'm a firm believer that we measure what matters and we invest what our priorities are. If you want to see an organization's commitment to equity and justice, look at their budget. Their budget is that moral document. And look at their board of directors, and who makes up that board of directors. Again, that reflects what their commitment and their priorities are. Mark Jones has shared a while ago that, in order to be anti-racist, you have to be historians. And I think Ramona has a really good video that's going to talk about that we live in a very history-driven present. We didn't just get here overnight, right? And so we have to situate our current reality, right, and think about the legacy, right? And we can't be stuck there. We understand that everything has a legacy. These things are rooted in really deep and destructive and oppressive pasts, and we have to know that before we move forward. I think this goes without saying, we have to compensate BIPOC leaders and folks for the work that they're doing, particularly the emotional labor that comes with this work that is often unpaid and unrecognized. We have to build our tolerance for discomfort. No one in this work has a right to comfort in this space, right? We have to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I'm looking at my white colleagues, co-conspirators and allies in this space. I want to be clear. It's one thing to, share power and to co-create, but that does not absolve you from ceding responsibility. This is everybody's work. The work of oppression and racism is not the work of just people of color. We didn't create it, or we don't necessarily uphold it, right? This is all of our responsibility. And then I think lastly, I just wanted to share the importance of celebrating all wins. This work can be thankless at times. And so, it's important, small or large, transactional, transformative, to celebrate the wins. It keeps folks empowered, engaged, enthused to move forward. And a colleague once shared with me, progress is not just looking at how far you need to go, but it's taking stock and looking back at how far you came. And it's so important to celebrate those wins and keep folks engaged. And so that I just wanted to share some of the just high-level thoughts I was thinking about in doing this work. And I'll gladly now turn it over to our panel. I'll start with Ramona to help ground us in this conversation. You shared some really informative, and you have this great video I think we're going to queue up. Do you want to intro it or have them kind of play that now?
So part of our campaign is educating not just public housing tenants, but those that want to be involved in the work. Our coalition is made up of different organizations at the national and local level. So we have some like Neighbors Helping Neighbors from Rockaway, Queens, New York, but then we're also working with Sunrise. And the way that we created that partnership, I have a history in private-public partnerships, although they've been sort of mutilated by the government since they found out about them. So one of the things that we do is when we have folks that come into our space that have the privilege of having a skill set that our members don't, we ask them to lean into that and also train up the member on how to achieve the work. So all of the production that comes out of Safe Section 9, from our education materials to the video you're going to see, is being worked on by one volunteer from Sunrise. His name is Jack, and he's a white guy, lives in Brooklyn, not originally from New York. And then he works with tenants to develop the layout of the video, what needs to be included, and for the voiceover, truly defining what that collaboration should always be like. So you guys can go ahead and cue it.
A lot of people associate public housing with major cities like New York and Chicago. But the United States' 970,000 public housing units are spread out over all 50 states, with 20% located in rural areas. All public housing is paid for under Section 9 of the Housing Act of 1937, which allows the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to distribute taxpayer funds directly to each city's housing authority. The law's stated purpose was to address, quote, the acute shortage of decent, safe, and sanitary dwellings for families of low income, end quote. Section 9 caps rent at 30% of resident income and gives residents the right to organize into resident councils to determine how money will be spent within their developments. Under Fiorello LaGuardia, NYCHA became the first agency in the U.S. to provide publicly funded housing. Although welfare recipients and people of color were barred from these early developments, years of pressure by housing advocates eventually loosened these restrictions, and by the 1950s, working-class Black and Puerto Rican residents had begun to move in. During the fiscal crises of the 1970s, these increasingly diverse developments became targets for budget cuts by politicians pandering to white anger toward the gains of the civil rights movement. Nixon halted all construction of new public housing in 1973. And in 1974, Congress created the Section 8 voucher program to push low-income tenants into the private market. Under the Reagan administration, HUD's budget was slashed even further, from $36 billion in 1980 to $15 billion in 1988. Reagan justified these cuts by stoking resentment towards public housing residents with the myth of the welfare queen, a person of color living lavishly off taxpayer assistance. As this stereotype took root, the combined effects of disinvestment and the crack epidemic devastated public housing and the lives of people who lived there. Instead of providing adequate funding, politicians used this crisis as evidence that public housing was an outdated model. With the Hope 6 program, President Clinton proved just as willing as Republican administrations before him to keep up the cruel cycle. Hope 6 provided grants for housing authorities to demolish existing developments, but they were not required to replace them with the same number of low-income units. Between 1993 and 2010, 98,592 units were demolished under Hope 6. Only 12% of those displaced actually moved back into their homes. When the Faircloth Amendment was passed in 1998, it made the number of Section 9 units at that time the absolute limit to the national public housing stock. So today, HUD can't fund any construction of public housing above that 1998 level. Decades of austerity have left NYCHA with $40 billion in unmet capital needs. Residents experience the shortfall every day through shoddy repairs, chronic utility outages, and life-threatening mold and pest infestations. Following a familiar playbook, elected officials and NYCHA CEO Greg Russ now want to use their own neglect of public housing as an excuse to eliminate Section 9 through privatization schemes like RAD and the Blueprint for Change.
Nice, right? I still get angry every time I watch it. I mostly, when I play it in a session, I try not to listen to it, which means that it's effective. But the content and the information, the statistics, the laws, the policies are something that usually are kept away from directly impacted people. And because that's one of the strengths that I developed working for government, I tell all of my tenants that if you can't use these statistics and you can't talk about these bills and you can't talk about the policy behind our situation, then I'm failing you, right? Because we have this culture where we want to come in communities, we want to create solutions, we don't really like or feel comfortable around the directly impacted people, right? There's a discomfort that automatically comes from meeting a stranger. And then you want to come in with your solutions, never really explain to us the root of the problem, or I would say at best, give us the resources to understand the root of the problem. And now you're investing money and investing resources, and humans are living under this imaginary bubble that says, I'm doing something about this issue. When in reality, you aren't, right? Like this whole conference has been really frustrating for public housing tenants. There's like 50 of us here. We're not really on the agenda. No speakers talking to our conditions. No speakers talking to the fact that public housing is the only truly affordable housing in the United States. And we're sitting in our chairs looking around like, why do you all keep talking about low-income housing tax credit, project-based Section 8, and affordable housing? And in the same sentence that you're all sitting in rooms talking about these things, you're saying none of that works. That stuff is broken. We got to do something. What are you doing if that's the conversation you're constantly having, right? There are many Black and brown people in this room that are living in affordable housing that are getting discriminated against, that can't find a dignified unit to live in, that can't hold their landlord accountable. But you, and I say that really on a personal level, to those of you that are not in that situation of public housing or affordable housing, discrimination and insecurity, you're sitting in a space that's not talking to us or listening to us. So how much equity is there even in you being here? Because I love DC, I've lived here. But I tell tenants, when you're coming out here, we're coming out here to work. I love a cherry blossom, I really do. But if that's on your agenda and it's not on your agenda to ask someone of color or someone with a disability to sit down with you for a few minutes so that you can listen to their life experience and develop a conclusion based on that, then you're wasting your time.
Thank you, Ramona. And Jay, thank you for joining us. If you could share a little bit, just kind of your work in the equity and justice space.
I'm learning a lot today, and this is, thank you for inviting me to be here, and Ramona, thank you for sharing your story as well as the video. I'm trying to figure out where to start here, because I think when you talk about race equity, it's always where do you start, right? And that's generally the question. And so I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about myself as an individual, because I think that my conversations about race started with the fact that I'm a biracial man that was raised by two white people, my grandparents, who, bless their hearts, tried their best, but there was always a conversation about, you don't want to be black, right? Like, you're not that person. And that was always something that I felt very deeply for a very long time. But race equity is love, and love is a verb. And so when I say that to say, this work is work, and it takes time, and no matter what your background is, you're starting it from a different journey. Throughout my life, I have gotten the pleasure of really getting to talk about race in ways that folks appreciate my experience, because I come to it from seeing both sides, or I see it from a black-white lens in a lot of ways. I began doing race equity work when I started doing work for the 2020 census, and that was where we were looking at the historically undercounted communities in the state of Alabama, which I don't have to really say much more as far as what Alabama looks like outside of the state. In that work, we had to work diligently with communities to figure out how we can best collaborate together and co-create systems that allow folks to be heard and be counted, because if you're not counted, you don't count. That was my first experience in really building a system that allows for individuals of lived experience to be heard. Following that, I went on to go work at Chapin Hall Institute for Children, where they had experienced massive growth over the 2-year period where I was working on the 2020 census, and they needed to figure out a way to support the diverse staff that they had hired on for the various departments, whether it be research, whether it be capacity building or advocacy. That work involved, like you said, investing in and putting their money where their mouth was to hire a third-party consultant to come in and really construct the barriers that folks feel when someone who is supervising you is asking you certain questions about, what do you need? What's important to you? Where are we falling short? Because it really did and when you think about power structures, you have to keep in mind that as a supervisor, you automatically have some kind of power over an individual, and their willingness to that affects their willingness to share with you what they might need and what they might see. I currently work for Collaborative Solutions, and we're doing something very similar, and I feel very grateful to share this with you, because in our last our last annual meeting, where our staff retreat, we were able to bring in a third-party consultant to really start to address these concerns. At Chapin Hall, what this ended up doing was it created a format for individuals to, and I mean, I'm talking about, this is a national staff. This is folks working all across the country, so the needs are diverse and varying. And we were able to really bring together folks who typically would not have been heard and they were able to share, and it created it began shaping the culture and reshaping the culture where folks were able to be in a system that wants to co-create policies and practices that best supports those individuals. And I start there because I do believe that the internal work at our organizations is where it begins and then it hopefully, and I believe inevitably, snowballs into the work that we do with communities.
I'm going to keep on that thread of community and go back to Ramona. I think what you touched upon earlier was just about accountable, right? What does it mean to be in deep and right relationship with community when we talk about accountability? I think a lot of times folks in organizations, institutions, when they think about accountability, think of funders and government and not people, right? And so could you pull on that thread a little bit more, and particularly what does accountability look like for white folks, for folks who hold social and institutional power to be accountable to community?
So, when we look in organization, right, and we see the structure, regardless of what, I had a boss in the military that was like, no, we're flat. And then in the FBI, it's like, no, we're hierarchy. And then at the Gap, it was complete chaos. But the Gap doesn't need to do the hiring of like an equity instructor, right? Like when you walk into a Gap, there's a built-in diversity because the values of the organization, right, dictate what kind of people will want to work for them and what kind of people shop there. And that's just in fashion, right? So if you think to the talk that Matthew gave yesterday, he was talking about the issue with the process for getting disability status, right? I've been in that process for 5 years, and I still haven't gotten it. And you're constantly denied. That same process of us constantly putting money into the lawyer that I will eventually have to hire is happening in equity as well. Like I remember a couple years ago, people saying, equity is going to become a thing. You should become a consultant. You can rake in the bucks. But if your organization needs to hire an equity consultant, you already failed. And that's the accountability, right? In the leadership and in the values of your mission. Because the money that you're spending on a consultant, and I think I'm cheap, but I'm pretty expensive, you could be putting that into creating positions, dividing workload, and hiring people that don't look or think like the ones you currently have in your organization.
I'm going to pull on that a little bit more and go to you, Jay. And actually, either one of you want to touch upon this. I think 2020, the latent economic and racial justice movements kind of burgeoned, right? And then, equity was a buzzword. I actually hate hearing that word, buzzword. But anyway, it was everywhere, all these new positions. And I think I saw a stat the other day that currently, like the makeup of like equity officers, over 50% are held by white males nationally. Just want to situate that, right? And so we have these, this awakening in 2020, commitments, proclamations were out there. People are saying all types of great things, right? Fast forward 2023, what are we seeing? What I call white lash, right? We're seeing criminalization of homelessness. We're seeing criminalization of CRT. We're seeing criminalization of woke. When you ask people what does woke mean, and they can't even define it, but they want to criminalize it, right? What are y'all seeing in this white lash, this backlash from these uprisings when people are just trying to advance equity and justice? And again, if you think this is separate from housing, racial justice is housing justice, right? We can't, separate the two. And so I'd love to, Jay, if you want to start, just kind of what you've been seeing in the last 3 years since the uprisings.
You ask what I see, and I see a failure, vehemently. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine a few weeks ago. He's a white man. He's working in corporate America. And despite the fact that we are all probably working in some kind of nonprofit field, I mean, I think that we can completely understand that corporate America makes up the majority of America, American jobs, American everything, the American economy. He was telling me that he had overheard a conversation between two supervisors. There's two black women, and he felt upset because of the content of this conversation. And these two women, they were discussing about a hiring practice, and they were thinking about who they would hire, and he overheard them say, well, if I had the choice, I would hire a black woman. He was upset, and this is a friend of mine who I have known for years. He was like, Jay, I heard this and I got upset, and I want to talk to you about why. And I'm like, okay, I'm here to listen to you, because I honestly believe that in a lot of ways, corporate America has failed in educating people about why equity work is so important. I really love the video that Ramona shared because it gives the historical context around why equity work is so important. But in many, I won't say most, but in many spheres of the American economy, you have people just throwing a mural up in the workspace and saying, that's equity, we're here. But without doing any kind of education before that to prepare folks for those discussions. And that is why we see the white lash. I firmly believe it is because folks have failed to do the educational piece and not take the step-by-step process that it takes in order to properly implement equitable practices in your organizations and then within your interactions and engagements with individuals.
Ramona, you want to add anything? Thank you, Jay.
I always want to add something. So, you know, in our coalition and in our community, we are living in conditions that buffer us from a lot of the white lash. Angry white people with pitchforks don't come to the projects. Just don't, right? So what I try to focus on and what I push on my neighbors and I is keep your eye on the budget, right? You mentioned that in the beginning. When people are in a room and they're telling us, like Wally did, but you know, there just isn't any money for that. Call bullshit. Because there is money. We know there is, right? So I focus on making them read and we summarize every single budget proposal. Because if you don't know where the money's going, you don't realize the harm that's gonna come to you, right? So we also work from, you know, tying in some of like the work that I've seen in the conference from a place of self-healing and like accountability to health. And that in itself is something that when an organization looks at equity, they very short-sightedly define what that means. If you have individuals that have lived in an environment where I have tiles from like 1955 that are made out of lead because my housing authority has been unable to put flooring in my unit for the last 10 years. I have peeling paint that if I don't take my funding, my personal money, and cover the holes in my wall created by leaks, there's lead and asbestos floating around me and my dog. Like, my dog doesn't have equity in my life. My dog came to me and he was like pure breed. I rescued him. He's a really annoying little miniature Doberman. And he came with no health issues. My dog is now allergic to 15 things. Can't even improve his well-being on like Royal Canin. And I'm making $178 a month. That's my income on public assistance. That's not something people talk about, right? So I force my tenants to tell people, this is what I get a year. This is what I'm living on monthly. And I'm managing my health deficits. I'm managing my dog's health deficits, which are all caused by the environment that we're living in, right? Because my grandma's been in this apartment. I always speak of her like she did not pass away from COVID. But Even my grandmother dying is because of equity. Public housing residents died and got infected by COVID at twice the rate of any other group in New York City. So her dying, my neighbors dying, all of my neighbors have at least 3 deaths a year at this point, related to a complication caused by how we live. And when people talk about the budget in spaces like this, and when you even look at the solutions that this conference is asking us to lobby for, we're not there. New York City needs $40 billion so that I don't get sick again. That changes the way you react to it, right? New York City needs $40 billion so that Brenda doesn't continue to age prematurely from the stress of sometimes having to walk up 17 flights. So that Kit and her children do not continue to get sick from mold and asbestos. But it's not a demand that people talk about. And I say all the time to my neighbors and I, don't come at me with a complaint and a problem. I have that teacher thing in me and I'm just like, don't. Bring me a solution. So for the last 3 years, we've been developing solutions at the city level, at the state level, at the federal level. We have an entire packet of bills. But because it's us talking about it, and because there's no equity, even in the spaces where a congressman like Richie Torres comes from public housing, is Black and Puerto Rican, but will not fund public housing, right? And all of us, if you talk to any tenant that lives in public housing, they absolutely love their home. We absolutely love our community. And that goes into pulling it apart and asking, why is your assumption that people that were living in Cabrini Greens or people that are living in New York City public housing, why do you assume we don't want to be there?
Yeah.
Because they don't want to do
Exactly. It's about you not feeling comfortable in that environment. Like, I'm glad people are working on rezonings. I'm glad people want to take down those walls. But last night, there was an article here in the DC area where people are like complaining about losing a canopy of trees if we build affordable and accessible housing, right? Those fights are going to continue in every state, city, and county that you're coming from. But if the federal government were to decide, and if people like you were to ask them to actually invest in public housing, no one could be discriminated against. We wouldn't have accessibility issues, right? Because we're ADA compliant. No one would have rental burden because we're capped at 30% of our income. And our children wouldn't have to face the fear of having to move multiple times, of not having grounded roots in a community. Like, I left to DC, I left to Hawaii, I left to DR, and I go back because that's where my roots are. My roots are, they spread out a lot, but that's where it is. The network of me is in the memory of my grandmother, in this apartment that we've had for 35 years, and in our neighbors. But the solution that keeps getting proposed is they must not be comfortable living like that. Who could live like that? Who could be happy like that? Happiness to me is being around my neighbors, seeing someone that saw me as a 10-year-old, right? That's my happiness, right? But in the question is this assumption of like, even the joy that a community feels and the comfort that a community feels now needs to be looked at from this lens of equity, instead of just like having an honest conversation with that community and say, what is it that you need? And then looking at the budgets and saying, well, none of that is there. And I think that's the role of white people. Because let's be honest, like, it's not on the rest of the isms. It is truly white men and many complacent white women that get into the habit of becoming diversity officers and consultants, or get into the habit, I'm going to end hunger, or I'm going to end homelessness. And mama, like, you're not. You're not.
And I think something you're touching upon that I think is so real in this work is who's getting centered in this work, right? And through whose gaze and whose lens is this work being viewed upon, right? And I think, this gets to my next question that I want to ask both of you, and I think you guys both hit it. Just, what concerns you about this work? Again, right, the folks are who being centered. I think we raised the gaze in which we look at our community that we love, but it's like something's wrong with it. It needs to be fixed. How could you want to live there? Because it's seen from their gaze, right? What else concerns you in these movements to advance justice and equity?
I think the thing that concerns me the most is the lack of education, and that's because it's due to the ripple effect of it. Thinking about outside of this room, who is not learning what they need to learn in order to get on board. The other thing that really concerns me is the lack of listening, the lack of the ability for individuals who are working in communities or to work with the community. I work in Alabama, and the biggest thing that I know that we can do is to host listening sessions or to go to community association meetings across the different areas of the state and listen to the issues that folks are having, and to ask questions about where your experience in the housing search, living in your unit, when you're facing eviction, and when you're trying to remain stably housed, what are the issues that you're seeing across that paradigm of the housing experience? Mm-hmm. And not enough people are doing that, because clearly you have folks that are just coming into your community and saying, these are the solutions that I have. Is it good enough for you?
Folks are so wedded to their solutions. They love their solutions, don't they? They are wedded to their solutions that they will create a problem just to use it. And so, you talked about education, and it made me think about you blessed this panel yesterday on a similar conversation, and someone talked about the intellectualizing of this work, right? And just the education, the books we need to read, the toolkit. And I think it's in earnest, but I just want to ask folks, and then I realize I need to go back to your Ramona, because I want you to answer that question as well about what concerns you. But the education piece just flagged to me, just wanting to read all the books, to get all the toolkits, but again, not apply it. And the thing is, what concerns me the most is that working with folks in the housing field, you are smart folks. Apply that same rigor for understanding LIHTC, for understanding this, to understand that what this work is about centering humanity, full stop. That's what it's about. But it's like somehow there's like a blockage, right? Like this is just too hard to comprehend when it is everywhere around us. So sometimes I wonder, do you want to comprehend, right? And there's no toolkit for liberation, right? And so you really have to apply, get right relationship, get into the community, have conversations in earnest. Don't come with your solutions. Listen, apply, advocate, co-conspire. And so, sorry, I'm getting back to you, Ramona, and thinking about what else concerns you in this work.
Nonprofits.
Tell them.
Oh my God. Like the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yes.
Is the end, right? Like, so all of us are volunteers in State Section 9. None of us makes a dime for doing this work. And we continue to do the work because if we stop, we're gonna lose our homes. So like yesterday, I was just like, I'm done, because Matthew didn't mention public housing. And I was like, how dare you have a conversation about poverty by America and not talk about public housing? And I was distraught. And I was like, I'm done. And then I was like, I gotta take a shower and I gotta put some clothes on because I can't be homeless. I can't be poor, disabled, indigenous, Latina, a woman, and homeless. Like, that's just too much, right? So to me, nonprofits, when folks ask, you know, my neighbors are like, okay, well, you know, what is it with these groups? You know, what do they do? I tell them they cater to folks that are sitting in a space, creating solutions, and they register, right? They sign up to fulfill that solution that has been pre-mandated. They do not work on the issues. You work for grants. Let me repeat that. You work for grants. You don't work for the person that's directly impacted. Because when I look at the money that is sent to New York City to work with public housing tenants, bro, I would have been finished with the campaign. To date, we've spent in the last 3 years, our total spending has been like $12,000. And the money we work with is a $20,000 allowance in discretionary spending funds from one of our state assembly members. That's all we have. And you see that video. Like, we are not creating inadequate deliverables. See how I speak the lingo too, right? That's code switching. And on code switching, it's a muscle. So I'm gonna put it on our community, right? Like, people of color, we code switch, we accommodate, we shrink, we step back 24 hours a day. Even with my loud walking stick, I do those things. And I'm tired of having to explain to people that don't have to do that 24 hours a day how to do equity. Why is it that because I got some melanin in me,
Yeah.
I had to automatically develop that muscle? Flex that muscle. If you live in a city where there's public housing, walk through it. Say hi to people. That's one of the first things I ask of our allies that are not of color. You need to stop walking home around the projects. And I take pride in the projects because the projects produce like Jay-Z. So, and Nas. He's definitely, I like him more than Jay-Z actually. But it's Beyonce, it's a whole thing. We're gonna go on a tangent. But I tell them, change the way you walk home. Change the way you drive. Say good morning to the people that you see huddled. Identify that we are a community, right? And engage us as individual members of a community, not as them or they, which is what nonprofits have trained you to do.
Yes, please.
I just want to piggyback on that real quick. Who got a call? What person of color in here got a call in the wake of George Floyd from a white friend? Just trying to ask, what can we do? Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to,
What were you doing?
like,
Right? Like, the answer to that question was, what have you been doing?
And where have you been?
I mean, Black Lives Matters is not about a person's death.
Right.
It is about a person's life. So if you haven't been moving like Black Lives Matters every day, don't ask me what I need you to start doing now that we lost another one. Because it's your responsibility to make sure we don't lose another one. It's not my responsibility. When we do a protest, we have white people come and hold the line. Because I can't afford to have my neighbors that are rah-rah, I'm not really rah-rah, but some of us are, right? Get arrested. Because if someone gets arrested, right? Let's say Cassandra gets arrested. Yeah. Am I going to be certain that Cassandra's going to get her medicine and her support?
Right.
If Tamik gets arrested, is he going to come out alive? And again, we think about this stuff automatically. Like the March on Women never has to consider these issues. Why? Because it's white women. Anytime that there's an event where we are dominating, we have to consider who are our lawyers, who from the ACLU is going to be there, and how many white kids can I get to stand up at the front. And Jack, I'm constantly having to tell him, get off the line because I need you to design stuff. Which means I don't have enough white kids. So like, where are your children? So like, one of my mentors that I love is Joe from the FBI, right? He has been in my life since 2008. He never called after George Floyd. Because Joe is a Catholic white man that wears a little bit of polyester sometimes. And Joe keeps me grounded in faith and in our friendship and in his support every single day. When I have a death in my family, I at least email Joe. If I'm having a crisis and if I'm in turmoil, I look to Joe. So if someone that you're trying to assist isn't looking to you all the time, it means that you're not really available to us. So that call is infuriating because you have the audacity in a moment where we're nationally grieving and concerned for our children, our nephew, our mothers, our sisters, our brothers, our cousins, our lovers. Now you want to ask me to tell you what to do? How dare you? You should have been doing something for us, with us, before this.
So you talked about flexing that muscle and how our allies, our co-conspirators show up in this space. I guess I want to leave just this last question. For folks in this room who are wherever they are on this journey, how do you want them to flex this muscle?
I'll let her close. That's better if she closes.
Man, hard. As an Indigenous person, I approach everything from a place of wholeness. So when I am developing a neighbor or investing, I say investing, right, in one of my neighbors, I take into consideration everything, the good and the bad. And then in that, we try to determine what is this person's strength? Because if our ancestors brought us to this point, and you've been called to do this work, I have to believe that there's something in each person that has prepared them to be a part of this fight. So I would put the same thing on our allies, right? If your muscle is design, be bold and design for the right people. If your muscle is consulting, find groups that don't have funding and support them. Because if I can live on $187 a month, you can afford to donate some hours. If you're a lawyer, find public housing developments near you. Ask them if they're being confronted and challenged with privatization via project-based Section 8. Tenants can't find lawyers to support them, to explain the leases. which are changing from a federal lease that afforded us great, rights and responsibilities and protections. And that's being replaced with a privatized form that's confusing and that's being forced on people. Translate it for us. If you speak a language, offer your translation services. If you have children, give me your children. Like, there's no reason why we need to feel like you need to be exceptional, because that's another issue that comes up, right? I gotta be like Mother Teresa.
The saviorism.
There's only one Beyonce. Like, there's not gonna be another one. So you're not gonna be that person, right? But there's a lot of Rihannas. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's fighting words now. No. No.
Yeah, I know there's some fans in here. But figure out what is your strength and then use that muscle in different spaces, in spaces that you're not comfortable, in spaces where that's needed. And do not expect to get anything other than experience in return. Stop monetizing your involvement in things. Unless you're paying one of us, and we do take donations on our website. If you're paying one of us, then flex your checkbook. When I made 6 figures and I was overwhelmed and parenting and couldn't be physically involved, I wrote checks. So pick one and just lean in, which really doesn't apply to a lot of people of color. We don't have the option to lean in like Cheryl wanted us to. But you do. So lean.
Thank you. Jay?
Do you mind repeating the question one more time?
Yeah. Asking how folks could show up. How can they, what muscles can they flex? We heard the flexing of the checkbook, flexing of the talents. It reminds me of Audre Lorde's quote, everyone, to find your space in this work and do it. Utilize the talents you have and do the work. Don't expect to be exceptional or a certificate. Do the work in earnest, right? So that was kind of the question.
The word that comes to mind is reconciliation. Because I'm thinking about relationships, and I'm thinking about even the relationship I have with my wife. And when we have a fight and we have some kind of disagreement that causes harm or some kind of deep trauma, and I'm not saying that my relationship is traumatic, just to be pointed.
What relationship is it?
I want to say that the most important part of that interaction or that experience is the reconciliation part. Understanding that that we can come back together and that we can make an effort to find a solution together.
We can come back together.
And it's about coming back together to address the traumas that our country have collectively experienced. Because I think that when you're thinking about race equity, it has to be about this is the collective experience that affects each and every one of us, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, your indigenous background, your religion. We have to face it every single day, and we have to come together in order to find that solution.
Thank you. Coming from the place of wholeness, I love that, both of you. First, I want to just give it up to our panelists. And I think we have some time, let's get intimate, let's get deep. We have about 10, 12 minutes. I want to hear from you all in the room. Okay, a couple of hands, a hand here. Okay,
So,
yeah.
I agree with 90+% of everything that you said. But I want to look at the other side as well. If, let us say that black people were in a position of authority. So let us say the white power structure overnight became a black power structure. How many of us would be open to opening it up to white people to come in and take over our power? So do you understand the situation? So sometimes sitting in the audience as a black person, I feel a sense of discomfort with the language that sometimes that we use. Remember when President Obama said, do not say defund the police because it will work against you. And some people went ahead anyway and we could have had more senators, but because of the language. So sometimes everything you said is true, but when we say white lash or like we make all white people sound angry, we know that there is a segment of the white population that is the most angry. And it's not every white person that is like that.
Yeah.
So let us be careful. Yes. Let us be careful that we do not make because if I was a white person sitting and sometimes I would just say, okay. But because unless I've been in America 20 years and nothing has changed or very little progress. And so we need to turn around and see if we can do something differently. Unless white people join the struggle, it's not going to get other races, join the struggle, it's not going to get anywhere. That's why the civil rights movement moved, because there were some white people who gave up their lives. When you just see a whole set of black people, the thing I love the most is when you see, like in Boston, we had a big rally against this white supremacists, and you should have seen it was like 90% white people. I'm like, where are the black people? That is what you want.
Right.
That is what you want to see. So let us change our language. So yes, there is a white lash, but let us not make everybody part of the white lash. Let us understand that anybody who has a power structure, even if I had a company, it was my family company, like KFC was my company, and then some other person wants to come and take it over, I'd be resisting. A lot of people resist this because it's not so much even about the color, because maybe if white French people come in, remember the Irish came in, they were white, the Germans came in, they were white. It's not so much the color as the power.
Absolutely.
It's the
Yep.
power. So nobody wants to give up power. I just know that. Nobody's going to tell you, hey, I'm a CEO, take my job, and I'm going to work at McDonald's.
Because I just want to say one thing real quickly.
We need people to come on board, so let us kind of change the language. And because without other races, especially white people coming on board, it's not going to work. So that's why I have the need for white input and the labors and the conversation. And the divisions, oh yes, the non-profits, oh my goodness, the salaries the executives make. And I mean, we have big name non-profits working in public housing. And the kids from public housing don't even go to their programs, okay? And then I started a very small non-profit. Our budget is like 1,000 or 5,000 at most. So right now we're taking public housing kids and putting them into robotics. Can you get funding? No, because all the MacArthur's and all the big foundations, they're giving the money to the non-profits who are doing nothing in the development itself. So everything you say is so totally spot on, but let us just think, sometimes the language is, let us do it with honey, honey.
Yeah. And I know we want to get to all the questions. I just want to, I really appreciate you for centering that and putting the context, because language matters. And it's important that we don't talk past one another, right? And I just want to be clear, what I'm talking about when I say white lash is, to you, it's social and institutional power. Race is a social made-up construct, right? We have more genetically in common than we do have separately. But if we don't name where power exists and how it's tied, and we have a racial hierarchy in this country, we're not benefiting anyone, right? And so this is not about white people, but the construct of whiteness, right? And so that's why I want to be clear, but I appreciate you for saying that. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
Just to quickly touch on that, because I do believe that you have to educate people on the concept of power sharing is not power lost. When I bring up the story of my friend JD that I had the conversation with, he came to me, he was like, Jay, I feel like I'm losing my power. I was like, my brother, you have had the power the whole time. and truth be told, just because someone else wants to share that power with you, that does not diminish your light and what you have to offer. And that is the conversations that we have to have. It's educating people on that subject matter.
And I'll just add shortly, under the construct of capitalism is where racism thrives, right? So we need to recognize that scarcity mentality of, oh, I'm going to lose what I have, is built into capitalism.
Yes.
right? So if you don't recognize that, you participate in saying, no, we have to, I'm not soft and gentle. I'm just not. One of my deities in my Taino tradition is representative of death and endings, and it's actually bees and honeys that are affiliated with it. And I tell my chief all the time, I don't get it. But you have to stop thinking in the way of scarcity. Expand the pie, and then no one loses.
Oh, bigger pie, absolutely. Shams, do you have a question? And then one in the back.
Wow, I hope I don't get beat up. So, I know you whispered white saviors, but I gotta ask. In my experience, most of my supporters as a homeless hero are white people. I've done a lot of work in New York City with their support. However, there came a point where there sort of been a conflict because it was almost like everything I was doing started to be co-opted. And so when I look at the struggles of civil rights, even the Black Power movement, and all of these historical things, I've always seen that when we involve white people, there's a point where those movements get co-opted and the gender changes. So when we look at the gains that we made, are they really gains, 50 years after the fact? And so my thing is, in real time, and seeing what I see just in my own experience, it is, how do we get to the point where we are able to pick and choose our leaders? How do we get to the point where we are able to define our agenda? Because nobody know what we need better than us. And how do we get to the point where we are able to convince those who want to support us that we are capable of leading our movements, we are capable of handling the money and doing the things that we need to do in our community. And while we respect your help and support, we can be the heroes in our own stories, we can control our own narratives, and we can create the right type of legacy that we need that's more sustainable than what we've seen when we've given it up to somebody else. Thank you for their help.
Thank you, Shams.
What I hear you talking about is that colonizer mentality. You build something and then it's your child essentially, right? And then it's taken over by somebody else. In my opinion, that is defeated through anti-racist practices and succession planning. And that is something that is very nonprofit industrial complexy. But at the same time, when I look at some of these organizations that were previously run by white men and then handed over to black women without any kind of succession planning whatsoever, I see the opposite effect, right? I see that they are given a system that is doomed for failure. And it adds to that narrative like, oh, we tried this that one time.
Yes. The setup.
And we can't do it again, right? Like, so it really takes having those hard conversations with the next person and talking about how you view the next step for your organization or your program, and then framing that from through an anti-racism lens.
And I want to make sure we had a question in the back here. Do you still have the question? Right here, yeah. Yes, please.
Just, coming from the public service side, this is a really interesting and valuable discussion. But we're kind of barely making it too, so kind of keep that in mind. But I think it's just kind of everything is local. So I, represent a small, mid-sized community with a small, mid-sized public housing authority, and what we're trying to do is do a lot of rehab. We're not, the demo reconstruction model wouldn't work for us because we just don't have, we have $7 million in a really good year to deal with over, housing units that are over 50 years old. And so 90% of the RAD projects that we've done, our tenants have moved back. So it is really a different situation, I think, in Dayton, Ohio versus New York City. So it's like we have to do that work of listening and understanding. That part never changes, but solutions are definitely going to vary depending kind of on where you are.
Yeah. Wow. So I want to first thank you, right, for having a public housing authority. You're already winning. So I think that's part of the self-reflection that needs to happen. Ask yourself, if I were getting $180 a month, what are the core services that I would need to thrive in Dayton? What would you need, right? How much money would you spend on groceries? What services are going to help you keep shelter? What's your public health like? Within the services of a health provider, how much mental health are poor people getting? Because I'm a huge advocate of therapy, right? And I thank a lot of my white friends for making it normal for me to be like, no, I have a 1 o'clock standing appointment. And it was my white girlfriends that were like, girl, you don't have one? You need to get one. But when I got one on Medicaid, I only get 30 minutes with him, right? In 30 minutes, you can't start. I can't even tell you how my day went, right? So now I would say education, experience, I'm exceptional in my community. I'm one of 3 graduate degrees in the South Bronx. In the South Bronx, not my development. In Congressional District 15, I'm one of 3. So my therapist shares with me, because he only serves the poor community. He says, there are some times that I can't even get from someone how their day is going. Because if you have a serious episode, right, and you need real support, that can't happen in 30 minutes. So it's the housing, it's the health, it's the food, it's the education. Are you noticing that charter schools are becoming a hot topic in your community? How are they being placed? Why do we need charter schools? Because I'm trying to stay out of that fight, because I'm like, this is the last one for me. But why is it that charter schools are only surrounding renters? Why is it that your public schools are thriving? Why is it that the school that your kids went to doesn't have metal detectors, doesn't have cops on site, has a field, has a couple trees? I mean, that's real basic stuff. You can observe that just walking your dog. So it's like the witness doesn't have to be a huge success, right? You don't have to do a huge overturn of all of the policies in your town. But the goal after today should be, I'm going to need to go into less and less sessions on equity. Because I'll tell you that the most successful relationships that I have with my allies are the ones where they don't need to come to equity sessions. Because they ask Safe Section 9 in meetings, is it appropriate for me to lead that? If I'm going to represent Safe Section 9, I need an ally that is a tenant to be present at that meeting. So there's something either generational or geographical that needs to turn on. Because New York is, I mean, compared to the rest of the country, we're just different.
We just different.
Right? So I would never hold everyone to the same standard of what's happening in New York, but just look around your town for those things, and then I think.
Yeah, I just want to recognize, so we are at time. However, we do have a break. I don't know, can we oblige folks with 5 more minutes? What do folks, but if folks need to leave, we have a break. I don't want to take away your break. Feel free to do that. Oh, yeah. Mhm. And
Trying to say something. I'm one of those white CEOs of a nonprofit, and I really got a lot out of this. What I want to say is I agree what you said. Power sharing is not power loss. I would add the principle of resource sharing, leadership, decision making. That's how we collaborate. And something that resonated when you were speaking is Obama called himself a progressive pragmatist. So I think there's some pragmatism in this. I worked for Janet Napolitano in Arizona, first Democratic governor in 25 years. This was 15 years ago. And we were progressive pragmatists because in a Republican-dominated state. So one of the thoughts I had, for nonprofits who have fundraising power about incubating or supporting something that then later spins off. And if we're having, and not that that's the solution, but how can we share the skills or resources that we have? And I've done that in other domains of stuff that I've done where you incubate something, you get the money, that starts, and then it spins off. Just a thought. It might not be what people want to do, but where can we use the resources and assets that we have to help further the work? So this has been very eye-opening, and thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the things that the comments made me think of in relation to your comment is we can't build whatever it is that we envision, right? So we're right to be in this space because it's good to have these conversations. That means that we're moving more people in the right direction. But you can't envision equity by excluding any particular group. So one of the things that I saw after the Black Lives Matter movement started taking on was in financing for small businesses. So I designed gift items on the side, and I have a small company. The grants for Latina women disappeared. Grants were only being made available for a significant amount of time to Black business owners. But what does that do, right? If you're not supporting poor white people, if you're not supporting working class people of every race, if you're not supporting indigenous, Latino, Asian, if your mission and the vision of like how you incubate and support and fund only applies to one sector, you're falling for the trap, right, of monetizing equity. You're participating in that. So if your organization is saying this is something that's available and that anyone within BIPOC can go for, that's better than highlighting one individual group because you're doing harm by excluding anyone. No one, this is not a competition about like who suffered more, right?
No Prussian Olympics, yes.
It isn't. It's a shared weight that BIPOC people carry. So the resources have to be shared the same way that the weight is being shared.
And sorry, one last comment, and then we're going to close the question. Yeah?
Yes, I had a comment, but I appreciate the wisdom in the room, and certainly a sister over here was talking about language, but I also am sitting with what Ramona said, right? And as people of color, right, we have to constantly shrink, and we have to be amenable, and we have to, oh, please, we have to beg for what we need and beg for justice. And what I'm saying is that there is an intersection of, yes, being amenable, being assertive, being aggressive, because that's how we saw civil rights play out, right? We had Martin Luther King, we had Malcolm X, right? There has to be a mix. Everyone in this room has their own unique gifts and talents. You are here for a purpose with a solution, but we all can't do it the same way because everyone doesn't respond to the same thing. So yes, sometimes the language has to be white lash. Sometimes you have to say white person. In other spaces, you might use different language. But it doesn't mean that we all have to travel this same path, the same way, right? Each of us has something to bring. And sometimes the language does have to be a little harsh to get people's attention. Sometimes it has to be soft. But I don't think we as a people should have to shrink, right?
Yeah.
Because we have power.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if I may, right, one important thing that allies can do is don't ask, how do you want me to move in this space? Go back to camp, right? When you went to camp, you showed up, you didn't know anyone, you were scared. I didn't get to go to camp, but that's what the movies showed it like. So you're socially anxious. Go through that. Figure out how to include yourself in the community. Because the minute that you ask us, we're like, here she go. Figure it out. We're people, right? We just look different. So if you're walking into camp on any given day, you're not gonna run into the group and be obnoxious and lead to being unwelcomed. Treat us like human beings and everything will be okay.
I think that's a great note to end off. Thank you all for a great discussion.